This lesson is over multiplying integers. So the first thing we're going to do is look at an expression, talk about what that means in words, draw a picture, and then finally come up with the value. After working several of these, we'll develop some rules for multiplying integers. So when you look at this, the first expression is something that you should already be familiar with, and it is 3 times 2. Now in words, this means 3 groups, that's what that multiplication sign means, 3 groups of, that's what the multiplication sign means, positive 2. So we're going to draw 3 groups of positive 2. And as you can see from your picture, that means your value is positive 6. So then we have 4, and that's going to be groups of, that's the multiplication sign, and then positive 2. So when I draw 1, 2, that's 2 groups, 3 groups, and 4 groups, I end up with a positive 8. The next one I'm going to look at is 3 times negative 2, and that is 3 groups of negative 2. So then when I draw my picture, I still have 3 groups of 2, but they're negative this time, so they're shaded in. So notice my total value is negative 6. So 4 times negative 2 means 4 groups of, that's your multiplication sign, negative 2. So I'm going to draw 1, 2, that's my first group, second group, third group, and fourth group, which gives me total negative 8. So when we look at this, notice when we had a positive times a positive, we ended up with a positive answer. When we had a positive times a negative, we ended up with a negative answer. So I'm going to do a couple more examples because there are a few other ways that we can look at this. So these aren't going to be on your notes, but you can still look at it. So say we had this problem. This is, you can't have negative 2 groups. So the way that we read this in words is the opposite of. So in words, this is the opposite of 2 groups of positive 3. So when I draw that, I'm going to have 2 groups of positive 3. That's first. But I wanted the opposite of that. So what is the opposite of 2 groups of positive 3? 2 groups of negative 3. So this represents my final answer, which is negative 6. Let's do one more of those. So again, this means the opposite of 2 groups of positive 4. So 2 groups of positive 4 looks like that, but I want the opposite of that. Okay, which means I have negative 8 total because this represents my answer. So again, notice when you had a negative times a positive, you ended up with a negative answer. When you have a positive times a negative, you end up with a negative answer. When you have a positive times a positive, you have a positive answer. So there's one more situation we're going to look at, and that is negative 2 times negative 3. Now, again, this negative sign still means opposite of. So this is going to read opposite of 2 groups of negative 3. So we needed 2 groups of negative 3 to start with. But remember, we wanted the opposite of that. So that's going to become 2 groups of positive 3. So notice your answer is 6. Let's try one more of those. Negative 2 times negative 4. So again, this is going to mean opposite of 2 groups of negative 4. So 2 groups of negative 4, those are supposed to be negatives. Let's color them in. Sorry, that's a little messy. But remember, we wanted the opposite of that. So the opposite of 2 groups of negative 4 is 2 groups of positive 4. So what that comes up with is a positive 8 answer. So notice when we had a negative times a positive, our answer came out a positive both times. And we'll go back to that when we develop the rules in a minute. So the next way that you can represent this with modeling is on a number line, just like we represented adding and subtracting on a number line. So this means 4 groups of negative 2. Remember, when there's no sign in between a parentheses, it means multiply. So here's your first group of negative 2. Notice I'm moving in a negative direction because it's a negative number. So here's your first group of negative 2, your second group of negative 2, third group, and your fourth group. Where did I end up? Negative 8. So that is my answer. So on this one, we're going to model 7 groups of negative 1. So I'm going to start at 0. Here's my first group of negative 1, second group, third group, fourth group, fifth group, sixth group, and seventh group. So I had 7 groups of negative 1, which gave me negative 7 as my answer. That's why I ended up right there. So we're going to develop some rules real quick. Whenever we had a positive times a positive, our answer was positive. Whenever we had a positive times a negative, that was 3 groups of negative 2. Our answer ended up negative. Oops, sorry. I'm writing the answer for the problem I just said instead of the general rule. So let me erase that real quick. So that ended up negative. Then we have a negative times a positive, which ends up giving us a negative, because that was the opposite of however many groups of something positive. The opposite of a positive is a negative. Negative times a negative, those ended up being positive. So these are your rules, although I find them a little bit confusing. So usually the way I like to think about it is when you have a positive and positive, are there any negatives here? No, so your answer is positive. When you have a positive and a negative, it takes 2 negatives to make a positive. So 2 negatives, and I'll always do this with my fingers kind of to remind me. So when you look at this one, do you have 2 negatives? No, so that's why your answer is negative. Do you have 2 negatives? No, so your answer is negative. Do you have 2 negatives? Yes, so your answer is positive. Let's try this with some numbers. What's 5 times 7, first of all? 35. Do you have 2 negatives? No, so your answer is negative. Do you have any negatives at all? No, so your answer is going to be positive. 11 times 11 is 121. 6 times 8, no negatives, so that's just a straightforward problem. How many negatives? Just 1, so my answer is going to be negative, and 2 times 5 is 10. So again, 2 negatives to make a positive. So let's practice a little bit more. Now remember, we're going to do picture models sometimes, so you need to understand what these mean. This is 3 groups of 3. No negatives there, so my answer is positive. This is 3 groups of -3, which gave me -9. I just noticed that I messed this up. Now this one means the opposite of 2 groups of 2. Opposite of 2 groups of 2. Well, that's 2 groups of 2. I want the opposite of that. And yes, you do need all these pieces to your modeling. So I need to see this thought process, 2 groups of 2. I want the opposite of that. This is 3 groups of -2. So 3 groups, -2. That gives me -6. The opposite of 2 groups of -2. So this is 2 groups of -2, but I want the opposite of that. So that is +4. So again, notice positive times a positive, positive. Positive times a negative, negative. Because there's not 2 negatives there, and it takes 2 negatives to make a positive answer. Only one negative, negative answer. Only one negative, negative answer. 2 negatives, positive answer. It's almost like those 2 negatives cancel each other out. Almost. Not exactly, but that's an easy way to remember it. Okay. So this time we have a negative times a positive, which gives us a negative, and 5 times 7 is 35. This one we have a positive times a negative, so negative, there's only one negative there, and 121. This one's a little trickier. A negative times a negative gives me a positive, and 6 times 2 is 12. Now we have a positive and a positive, so that's going to give me positive 48. Positive times a positive is 10, times a negative, well, there's only one negative there, so I'm going to get -20. So again, our rules is a positive and a positive. Okay, there's no negatives there, so you don't have to worry about anything. A negative times a positive, only one negative there, so your answer is negative. A positive and a negative, only one negative there, so your answer is negative. A negative and a negative, that makes a positive because it takes 2 negatives to make a positive. Okay, that's it for today. Pardon me, I'm losing my train of thought. That's it for today. So tomorrow we'll do dividing integers.